I want to talk a minute about podcasting. And in particular, podcasting for your photography clients. You know, I've been podcasting for a very long time. This podcast in particular, I had a direction I wanted to go with it originally. The first, 16 episodes or something were all in this one direction. And it shifted, right? Now, this podcast is not designed for my photography clients. It's designed for photo enthusiasts and professional photographers of all kinds to listen to and be inspired and learn from. And for those who just want to hear my ramblings, right? Think of this as a notepad for photography, okay? Now, I did have a podcast in the past during the pandemic that I called Jersey Brands. It's still available to listen to. And that podcast generated me business locally here in New Jersey, where I live. It generated me business. And you might be wondering how, right? I'm going to give you another example, though. There's a very well-known podcast called The Vendor Table. That podcast, again, was started by two wedding photographers specifically to target local wedding vendors to learn more about the wedding photography business from the photographer perspective. And that is doing really well for those two photographers. They've gotten a lot of bookings from the podcast, from the vendors, the venues, the florists, etc., that listen to that podcast. My Jersey Brand show was designed specifically for businesses. During the time when people were doing porch family portrait sessions, I was doing them as well. During the pandemic, you couldn't be close to people. You'd have to wear a mask, right? So what I would do is I would actually wear a mask and I would use a long 7200 lens from a distance photographing these families. No risk whatsoever. But what I did was I wanted businesses to photograph in the same way to make the businesses stand out because no one was doing it locally, to have businesses doing these sort of porch sessions. So I started this podcast talking about different brands in the area and things that I noticed that they could be doing better. And I got businesses to contact me and say, hey, I'd love to do a photo session with you. We'd love to do this family a porch session style, but with all of our employees out in front of the store or whatever it was. And I would do it. And it was easy money. They didn't need prints. All they needed was the digitals for their marketing. They were pushing hard on deliveries, this like hands-off, contactless restaurant style that blew up during the pandemic. So the whole idea was have all of your employees wearing masks with your company shirt on it, a company shirt logo, right, on the shirt, whatever it was, and you'd be in front of the building, and that would be the portrait session. And it did really well. I got a bunch of jobs during the pandemic of that specific thing from a podcast where I had maybe 6 episodes. And it just goes to show you that you can have a podcast. Yes, you need to have the brand in place locally in order for something like that to exist and like do well. If I just launched the podcast, no one would know about it, right? So I had to be able to push it in local groups. I had to be able to push it on my Facebook personal profile for businesses to start seeing. And that is what people saw. Oh, he's got an authority. He understands my business. He understands what's happening during the pandemic. He knows photography. He's trusted. And I'm going to hire this guy, right? Or girl, or whoever it might be. And that's what happened. So no matter the genre you are in photography, you can have a podcast that is for your clients. You can. It's just a matter of figuring out what will work. And can you do it alone? Do you need a partner? Do you need a team? Or can you just do it like what I'm doing right now for Photo Breakdown, where I'm talking to the camera, I've got a microphone, and I am just talking about what's on my mind. Now, if this was about business and local businesses, I could be talking and rambling about that. In fact, the first 1 or 2 episodes of Jersey Brands was done on my phone from the car. I would drive past a building, I would notice something, and I would stop, open the voice notes app on my phone, and hit record. That's what it was. No fancy mic, no nothing. It's just hitting record. So if you have an idea, if you have interest in starting a podcast, okay, figure out what the topic should be to target your customers. Figure out what the topic should be that your customers would be interested in. Now, if you need help starting the podcast, I do have a podcast called Learn to Podcast. You can go to learntopod.com, and I think it's a 16, 18 episode podcast where it's basically a book in podcast form, walking you through all the steps you need to do to get started. And on my website, I've got links and stuff to different tools and resources and things like that you could basically, utilize to get started with your podcast. But again, all you need is your phone, the voice notes app, and hitting that record button to get started. From there on, it's not much to get the podcast launched. So think about it. But first step 1, do you need a podcast? Do you want a podcast? What would the topic be for the show that would interest your target market? Whatever your clientele is, will that work? Will you be able to find something to make that work in a podcast? Think about it. Thanks for tuning in to this ramble. I don't know what brought this to my mind right now, but some conversation I was just in must have done it. I've had 3 meetings already this morning. Something must have triggered this idea to talk about for this episode of Photo Breakdowns. Anyway, I will link to Learn to Podcast. I'll even link to Jersey Brands if you really want to listen to it in the show notes. And thanks for listening to this episode of Photo Breakdowns.